rain on tin, a line of soaked uniforms, a silence thick enough to chew. If you've ever wondered how a single cup of tea could crack years of propaganda, keep listening. Because by the end of this story, that small kindness will make you question what strength really means in war. They had warned her for months. They said the British were soft and decadent, that their empire was crumbling. That capture would mean humiliation at best and brutality at worst. She believed it because everyone around her believed it, and believing felt safer than doubting. She wore a gray auxiliary uniform, not a frontline soldier's kit. Signal duties, clerical shifts, watches in cold rooms with telephone cords tangled around her wrists like vines. She had done what she was told, the way millions did in those days, because asking questions was dangerous and answers were scarce. She reached the intake desk prepared for a barked command, a shove, a strip search in a concrete room. Instead, the sergeant, mud on his boots, ledger at his elbow, looked up, met her eyes, and slid a dented tin cup across the table. Steam rose in a faint spiral. Tea. Sit. Processing takes time. Tea. Not a trick, not a test. Just heat in a cold morning and a chance to breathe without counting the cost. The room didn't change, but something inside her did, like the first hairline crack that runs across ice before it shatters. This is not a fairy tale. It's what records, regulations, and contemporary accounts tell us about how prisoners were supposed to be treated, and often were treated, in those unsteady months after the fighting stopped. If you stay with me to the end, we'll set aside rumor and look at what the law required, what the inspectors recorded, and what Parliament debated when the war dust still hung in the air. And then, only then, we'll ask the question that matters. Why did a simple act like sharing tea feel more dangerous to a belief system than any weapon on a battlefield? She cupped the tin between both hands, letting the heat climb back into her fingers. The rain smacked the corrugated roof like impatient knuckles. Her name, age, last posting. An interpreter bridged the words like a narrow plank across a wide river. She answered, waiting for the moment when the tone would turn from polite to punitive. It didn't come. Next was the medical station. A table, a lamp, a nurse who carried herself like a metronome set to calm. The checks were methodical. Temperature, throat, eyes, a glance. Through the hair for lice. The nurse paused when the auxiliary flinched and lifted both hands to show they were empty. I won't hurt you, she said in careful, accented German. I'm checking for lice, that's all. If you've ever had your world run by whispers about enemies, about allies, about who is us and who is them, you know that the scariest thing is not cruelty. It's kindness. Kindness forces a reckoning. Now, let's be clear about something from the start. War is chaos. Not every guard is gentle. Not every rule is followed. But there were rules, and they mattered, because rules give shape to what is expected. The law of the day said prisoners were to be adequately housed, sufficiently fed, and protected from violence. Inspections were not optional theater. They were part of the machinery of accountability. There were policies about work, about pay, about letters home, about repatriation once the guns fell silent. Those policies didn't erase all suffering. They did set a standard. And standards, enforced, change behavior. Back in the medical station, the nurse found a scratch, the kind that happens when barbed wire meets a hurried sleeve. She cleaned it, applied antiseptic, wrapped it with a square of fresh bandage that felt almost luxurious after months of improvising with rags. Keep it clean, the nurse said, writing a note on a clipboard. Come back in 3 days so we can check it. 3 days. The auxiliary had trained herself not to think in futures. 3 hours had felt like a luxury. 3 days sounded like someone else's problem, someone else's life. But the promise hung there anyway. A small appointment with tomorrow. If you're watching because you crave the hidden corners of World War II, the parts that don't fit neatly into myths of heroes and villains, this is your episode. Drop a comment right now. Does kindness from an enemy feel like strength or weakness to you? I'm not asking this to be sentimental. I'm asking because the answer changes how we understand the end of the war and what came after. The intake ended with assignments. Not punishments, not spectacles, assignments. A bed in a Spartan barracks, metal frame, thin mattress, blanket folded with a precision that looked like a moral statement. A trunk for belongings, empty like a new notebook, it wasn't luxury. It was order. And order, after months of collapse, can feel like mercy. Breakfast the next morning showed the pattern. Porridge, bread that tasted like wheat rather than defeat. Tea poured into cups that had stories engraved in their dents. A bell set the rhythm. Work details followed. Laundry, kitchen, administrative tasks, farm support. The kinds of duties that make a place run even when the place is temporary. If you're picturing a slack line of bored guards and arbitrary cruelty, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought and keep watching. There's another picture here, painted in. Regulations and inspections and minutes from debates, and it looks different than the propaganda that both sides pushed in their own ways. Which brings me to the framework you need to truly understand this story. Before we go deeper into our composite auxiliaries experience, let's anchor ourselves in what we can verify. The rules that governed prisoners at the time set out basics, where they could be housed, what they had to be fed, the medical care they should receive, and the protections they were due. The concept was straightforward. Even in war, there are lines you do not cross, not because the other side deserves your mercy, but because you deserve your own standards. Hold on to that thought. It will matter later when we talk about what victory looks like after the shooting stops. Inspections by neutral observers served as a pressure gauge. If a camp strayed, reports followed. If reports were damning, questions were asked. And if questions were asked in the right rooms, policies changed. Is that perfect? No. Is it better than rumor and vengeance? Ask yourself what societies become when vengeance is the only rule. Back in the office, the auxiliary sorted files under the eye of an officer who seemed almost allergic to drama. By date, then alphabetically, he said, in the voice of a man who has said those words every day for a year. She misfiled a folder. He sighed, not the theatrical sigh of a bully, but the weary exhale of someone who wants to go home, and handed it back. Try again. It happens. That sentence is going to stick with her for a long time, because it contains an idea that totalitarian systems hate. Error without punishment. If you've grown up on a diet of fear, the absence of punishment feels like a missing step on a staircase. Pause and imagine this from the other side of the fence. You're a guard or a clerk in a camp in a country that is exhausted but still standing. You've seen the photographs that aren't rumors. You've stood in rooms that smell like damp wool and old paper and the stubborn hangover of war. And you have a choice every shift. Perform your duty with minimum dignity or treat people like broken tools. Which one of those choices protects your sense of who you are? Which one takes courage when rage would be easier? I want your thoughts in the comments. In a system built on discipline, is restraint a kind of bravery? By late spring, the rain slackened and the fences started to feel less like bars and more like lines on a map. People waved at each other. Awkward, hesitant gestures like learning to speak with your hands. A truck rolled out with soldiers laughing the laugh of people who have counted the days and now finally get to count down. One soldier waved at the women without irony, like he was waving at neighbors. A few hands rose in return before reflex yanked them back down. There's a moment in every unlearning when muscle memory fails. Waves come up and you realize you're not sure what you're waving at anymore. Enemy, person, both, neither. Now, I promised we'd build to something by the end. Not yet. For now, let's layer in context so the revelations later don't feel like plot twists. They feel like truth landing. Here are the pieces. First, the idea that female auxiliaries were a footnote is false. Hundreds of thousands served in communications, anti-aircraft spotting, meteorology, logistics. Administration, uniforms without rifles are still uniforms. Service without frontline fire is still service. That mattered when the accounting began after the surrender. Second, the apparatus of prisoner management in Britain did not materialize overnight. It had machinery, intake, medicals, work, pay scales, disciplinary procedures, correspondence rules, and crucially, oversight beyond the unit level. When we talk about policy, we are talking about daily life, the length of a shift, the contents of a meal, the tone of a briefing, the right to a letter home. Policy is not a memo in a drawer. It's the shape of your days. Third, re-education wasn't a euphemism for punishment. It was a program. Lectures, newspapers, films, discussions, meant to expose the lies that had been repeated until they sounded like facts. We'll come to a projector later, and what unspooled on its screen will sit like a weight on the chest. Not yet. Hold that space. Let's go back to work details, because they say a lot about what the victors wanted to rebuild and how they wanted to rebuild it. Agriculture needed hands. Bridges needed repairs. Paper needed filing, because paper is how you make the past legible. Women with clean security checks were assigned to tasks that matched their skills. Clerks to desks, cooks to kitchens, quick learners to farms where the rhythm of dawn and dusk leaves little time for ideology. The idea wasn't to erase accountability. It was to prevent idleness from fermenting into poison. At midday on a farm, there is a sacred ritual that looks like a meal: bread, pickles, strong tea, maybe cheese if rationing allowed. It is astonishing how quickly those simple foods rehabilitate a person who has been living on substitutes. You cannot build a moral argument out of a sandwich, but you can build trust one swallow at a time. One day, the farmer's wife, hands lined by work, voice trimmed of nonsense, nudged an extra half slice of bread onto the auxiliary's plate and said, "Nothing more than eat." In a different life, the auxiliary might have wept. In this life, she learned again how to chew without feeling watched by a judge who lived in her head. If you've ever changed your mind about something important, you know the process is slow, almost mechanical. It doesn't happen in a speech. It happens in the repetition of ordinary decencies until the extraordinary lies that once looked inevitable start to look fragile. Write in the comments. What changed your mind? About something you were sure of? Was it a single event, or the drip of small evidence? Back at the facility, afternoons passed in clerical order. The officer with the spectacles and the permanent frown of mild concentration kept speaking to her the way supervisors speak to staff everywhere. Concise instructions, corrections without theater, praise so rare it felt like a medal when it appeared. On the third day, she remembered her bandage check and presented herself at the medical station without anyone dragging her there. The nurse looked pleased in a quiet, practical way and replaced the dressing with a care that felt rehearsed, as if the nurse had decided long ago that doing things properly is a kind of dignity. This is where we draw a line between cruelty and firmness. The place had rules. The rules had teeth. You could be confined for breaking them. You could lose privileges, but the punishment sat inside a framework that assumed your humanity, not your permanent guilt. That is not softness. That is a discipline that makes room for a future. Evenings were the sound of boots on gravel, low conversation, a harmonica, the flit of a moth in a cone of light. Someone had a book in a language the auxiliary couldn't read, and still she watched the reader turn pages like a prayer. A rumor moved through the barracks that a film would be shown later in the week, some official program about what really happened. The phrase turned stomachs and stiffened spines. People who have been fed a story for years do not line up happily for a replacement. But the announcement hung there anyway, like a curtain drawn partway. We'll get to that projector in our next chapter. For now, stay with the quieter transformation that happens before a film flickers in the dark. In the late afternoon, a guard took up his post near the fence, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with the accent of a place where vowels rolled downhill. He leaned on the wood, breathed out smoke, and watched absolutely nothing with the intensity of a man determined not to think too hard. The auxiliary approached, hands visible, English shaky. "Why are you kind?" He blinked, startled. Not at the question. That question lives under every encounter like a bass note. But at the fact that she asked it out loud. "Why wouldn't we be?" He shrugged. "War's over. Your people." There are sentences that feel like a hand reaching out in the dark. Your people is one of them. Not angels, not monsters, not cogs, not symbols. People. Let me be blunt. This line, "War's over. Your people," is a creed. It's a choice to define victory not as humiliating your enemy, but as refusing to become what you fought. That choice has consequences. It shapes how you run a camp, how you write a report, how you answer when Parliament asks, "What are we doing with these people and why?" We're building to those questions and to an answer that startled even some of the civil servants who had drawn up the rules. Before we get there, I want to plant one more seed. Truth does not only arrive with trumpets. Often, it arrives with paperwork. In the administrative office, an envelope appeared bearing stamps from a neutral organization that had made itself unwelcome in many places by insisting on looking where others preferred to look away. The envelope was opened, logged, and filed the way all envelopes were. Inside were the dull stones of bureaucracy. Forms, a report, a schedule. To the auxiliary, it meant nothing. To the system, it meant that someone outside the fence would be looking in again, checking, comparing, asking, is the standard being kept? Standards and inspectors might sound boring, but they are the scaffolding that holds a decent society together when rage could just as easily collapse it. If you've ever worked in a place where someone, somewhere, is going to check whether you did the right thing, you know how behavior bends under that gaze. Now, because I want you to stay through the end and not click away, I'll tease what's coming. We will arrive at a hall where a projector stutters to life and a room of women watch images that argue with everything they were told to believe. We will reach a debate that spills into the night and leaves friendships shivering on the line. We will read the words of officials who had to decide whether the bonds between former enemies could ever be sanctioned. And at the very end, we will return to a cup of tea and ask if it was, in its way, a more powerful weapon than any bomb. Because it forced people to look at themselves in a mirror that did not flatter. Until then, consider this. Strength is not the absence of emotion. Strength is the decision to act within rules when breaking them would feel satisfying. Tell me in the comments if you agree, or if you think restraint is just fear in a pressed uniform. I really do want to read your perspective, because the debates we're about to witness are still echoing in our politics and our personal lives. The auxiliary lay awake that night listening to the sound of a world reassembling itself one small act at a time. A guard's footsteps, the soft clink of a mug on a wooden table, rain easing to a mist. She realized that tomorrow she would wake up and know what came next. Make the bed, cue for breakfast, report to the office, change the dressing, note the time of the film. She had not known what came next for so long that the predictability felt like a gift she hadn't earned. And that was the other truth pressing in on her. This wasn't kindness as reward for innocence. This was kindness as policy, because the victors had decided that how they treated their prisoners would say more about their victory than any parade. If you're still with me, and if that idea stirs something you can't quite name, stay to the end of this series. The last minutes will change the way you measure winning. And as you listen, think about what standards you want your side to uphold when they have the power to. Do otherwise. Drop your answer below. It matters. Tomorrow, the projector will hum, the room will darken, the film will begin, and the crack that started with a cup of tea will widen. When it does, I'll be here with you, not to lecture, but to ask the question that matters more than any slogan. What do we owe the truth once we've seen it? Continue. The projector arrived in a wooden crate that smelled like dust and oil. Two men carried it in with the awkward care reserved for babies and explosives, set it on a table, and began threading film through its metal throat. A hush slid over the room as the women settled onto benches, arms folded, jaws set, skepticism clamped like a visor. A single sentence on a typed notice had summoned them. Instructional film. Contemporary events. No more detail than that. Ambiguity does its own kind of work. When the lights clicked off, the machine began to chatter. Light trembled onto the sheet tacked against the wall. The first frames were of roads, gates. Faces, not staged faces. The kind of faces that don't know they're being looked at by the future. The auxiliary sat very straight, hands on her knees, and tried to hold herself together by force of posture. What she saw contradicted what she had been told for years. The screen didn't shout. It documented. The room breathed in unison, shallow and synchronized. No one was asked to make a speech at the end. They were asked to think. The lights came up to reveal a sea of stunned expressions, but the stunned wasn't uniform. Some eyes hardened as if bracing against a blow. Some glossed over with quiet tears. Some went blank. The human equivalent of pulling a curtain when the sun is too bright. A British officer spoke without theatrics. Some of you knew more. Some of you knew less. All of you were part of a system that made it possible. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Evidence is loud, even when whispered. The benches scraped. The women filed out. Conversation broke open like a damn, it's staged. That was the first defense, a shield made of doubt. They make films like that to weaken us. I heard rumors. That was the second, admission without ownership. Everyone said it was enemy exaggeration. We were told to ignore it. We had orders. The third and oldest, obedience as absolution. In the barracks, arguments tangled. Words like lies, exaggeration, and couldn't be true did battle with I suspected. I didn't want to look. And the hardest phrase of all, what if we were wrong? Our auxiliary said little. She felt something granular inside her grinding into a different shape, the way sand becomes glass under heat. You might be tempted to think that a film can't change a life. On its own, maybe not. But a film, shown inside a system that feeds you decently, treats your wounds, and speaks to you without humiliation, that film lands differently. It finds a landing strip built by 100 small consistencies. Meals served on time, rules stated clearly, punishments proportionate rather than performative, letters delivered, inspections logged, and yes, a cup of tea placed in front of you just because that's what people do at a table. The next day in the office, the auxiliary noticed a newspaper printed in her language. Articles about town councils, court proceedings, food distribution. Essays about what democracy expects from citizens who have spent years being told that obedience is the highest virtue. The officer allowed her to borrow it during a break. Words she hadn't read in years resurfaced with their original meanings. Law no longer meant a weapon pointed downward. Debate didn't mean danger. Every paragraph argued with the slogans stamped into her memory. Work details continued. Account books balanced, rosters updated, farm placements arranged. Agriculture needed hands. Cows must be milked whether governments stand or fall. The auxiliary's name appeared next to a dairy again that week. Early departure, late return, a day measured by hooves and buckets and the satisfied sigh of an animal that has been cared for properly. The farmer's wife worked without commentary, but the patterns of care were their own schooling. Clean the equipment because clean tools don't betray you. Stack the pails the same way every time because order saves you from mistakes when you're tired. Eat when the bell rings because hungry people make poor decisions. At midday, the auxiliary sat at the scrubbed wooden table and ate in silence while a clock ticked. She couldn't reconcile the simplicity of that room. A plate, a cup, a folded cloth, with the complexities unspooling in her head. When the farmer finally spoke of a loss, one name, one place, one sentence delivered without accusation, she felt her throat tighten. Grief, she realized, sounds the same in every language. It doesn't need adjectives. Back at the facility, the rhythm of governance moved around her like a machine with transparent gears. A notice about correspondence reminded prisoners how often they could write and what could be included. A medical chart listed vaccination schedules. A posted rule explained work payment in terms that were both bureaucratic and oddly compassionate. Labor would be compensated within the system's limits. Earnings could be used at the canteen. Discipline for infractions would be specific, not theatrical. This wasn't leniency. This was deliberate, regulated decency. Here, then, is the fork in the road that the victors faced and that the records preserve. When you win, do you reshape your enemy by breaking them further or by showing them what standards look like in practice? The choice to feed someone properly is not only about calories. It's a thesis about what kind of world you intend to build now that the rubble is yours to clear. If you've ever made a difficult apology, you know you can't be forced into it. You have to be invited. The system these women encountered didn't demand confession. It demanded attention. It said, look at the evidence. Read a newspaper that doesn't lie to you as policy. Follow rules designed to protect dignity rather than flatten it. And then decide what that means about who you were and who you want to be. Late one afternoon, the auxiliary saw a pair of men with armbands she didn't recognize move through the facility with notebooks. They spoke briefly with staff, walked the perimeter, glanced into the kitchen, peered into the dispensary, checked mattresses, asked dry questions. Their presence was unremarkable to the guards and electric to the prisoners. Neutral eyes change the air. You can feel when an outside standard has stepped into a room. Inspections came and went without fanfare, but news of them traveled quickly. They had asked about food, hygiene, discipline, medical stock, work hours, letters, parcels, the state of the latrines. Yes, even that. The auxiliary was surprised by her own reaction. Relief. Not because she imagined herself in danger, but because she understood, perhaps for the first time, that a rule is only as sturdy as its enforcement. A promise without a witness can be broken quietly. A promise with a witness becomes a habit. That evening, as the sun burned low behind the fence, the same guard with the rolling vowels took up his post. He acknowledged her with a nod that had become, over time, almost friendly. "You watched the film?" he asked. She hesitated. "Yes." He waited. "It was difficult," she said. He ground the word like a pebble. After a moment, "Truth often is." She wanted to ask him what he had seen during the war, what he carried home behind his eyes. She didn't. Instead, she asked a question that felt both smaller and larger. Why the rules? She gestured vaguely to the notices, the schedules, the inspections, the steady drumbeat of process. Why so many? "Because if we don't hold our own line," he said, "we'll cross theirs without noticing." Hold that sentence in your mind. If a cup of tea was the crack, this is the wedge. Standards chosen when no one is watching. Weeks turned into patterns. The auxiliary learned to anticipate inspections by the way officers straightened their papers and the kitchen scrubbed at the corners. She learned that letters home mattered as much as rations and that a parcel could thaw a mood like sunlight through thin ice. She learned that punishment, when it came, had shape and reason. One woman who tried to smuggle out a note through an unauthorized channel lost canteen privileges for a defined number of days. She did not lose her dignity. The second film night arrived with less resistance and more dread. The dread of coherent evidence rather than rumor. The projector flickered again. This time, the content widened, not only the crimes, but the structures that enabled them. Laws written to narrow rights, youth. Organizations designed to recruit obedience. Media trained to praise power at the expense of truth. It was an education in how ordinary life can be turned into a conveyor belt that delivers catastrophe without raising its voice. Afterward, the discussion period was moderated by a man with the air of a schoolmaster. He asked questions, invited responses, and, most importantly, insisted on specifics. "You say you didn't know. What did you read? What posters did you see? What did your supervisor say to you the day the rules changed? Write it down." The auxiliary realized that vagueness had been her shield. Specificity pierced it. In the office the next day, she asked for extra paper. Officially, for filing. Unofficially, for remembering. She made a list. Rules she had accepted without scrutiny. Slogans she had repeated without thought. Silences she had considered harmless. The list embarrassed her. It also steadied her. You can't dismantle a belief by hating yourself. You dismantle it by tracing how it was built and refusing to rebuild it. Summer brought a different light and a loosened string of restrictions. Women with clean security reviews were allowed work outside more frequently, escorted out in the morning and back by evening. On farms, in workshops, in municipal offices, they met civilians who had lost as much as they had and yet chose to speak without bile. Small talk did what small talk does. Humanized. Standing in a shop queue with ration books and patience makes everyone an equal for 5 minutes. 1. Afternoon. The auxiliary returned to the facility carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. Inside, soap, a pair of thick socks, a small tin of tea leaves, a gift. She stared at the items laid out on her bunk as if they might rearrange themselves into a different explanation. She felt gratitude rise. And then another feeling she recognized only because it was so new. Responsibility. Kindness, she realized, doesn't erase what you've done or what you've ignored. It obligates you to do better with the next decision. Let's step into the archives for a moment, not with footnotes, but with the narrator's quiet assurance that the paper trail exists. Reports were written. Debates were held in sober rooms where men and women in suits argued about the fate of people in uniforms. Numbers were counted. How many held? How many repatriated? How many allowed to work? How many granted permission to start new lives where they had once been labeled enemies? This isn't rumor. It's bureaucracy. You can almost hear the pages turning. The auxiliary didn't read those records. She lived their consequences. Notices appeared announcing phased returns to home countries. Criteria for earlier release. Health, dependency, employment offers, and procedures for those who had no homes to return to because homes had become ash. Whispered conversations started in corners about the future. Will you go back? To what? I don't know. These were not dramatic confessions. They were practical questions, the kind people ask when the ground shifts and they have to choose a direction before the light fails. With every decision the authorities made, one message grew clearer. We will not win the peace by mirroring the ugliness we fought. We will win it by insisting that institutions can be firm without being cruel, that evidence can change minds, that work can restore dignity, that standards, enforced by neutral eyes and defended in public, can become habit. By late summer, the auxiliary looked different, not dramatically. War drains slowly and replenishes just as slowly. But her cheeks had a little more color. Her gait had steadied into something that resembled purpose rather than submission. In the mirror, she saw a person, not a uniform, not a slogan on legs. She passed the guard at the fence and offered a nod she wouldn't have imagined months before. He returned it without comment. Familiarity, she realized, is its own kind of treaty. One evening, during the last light, a truck stopped beyond the wire, and men climbed aboard with the careful joy of people who have earned their passage. They waved again, untheatrically, the way neighbors wave across a hedge. Several women waved back, openly this time. No one barked at them to stop. The gesture hung in the air, ordinary and revolutionary at once. If you're still watching, I want you to write one sentence below. What's the smallest act of fairness you've experienced that altered your view of someone you thought you understood? A seat offered on a bus? A rule enforced evenly? A correction delivered without humiliation? Tell me, because these are the hinges history turns on. We tend to narrate the past with battles and treaties, but in rooms like this, with cups of tea and rules pinned neatly to corkboards, you can watch the long work of civilization. Convincing people that power can be disciplined, autumn approached with its own decisions. Papers announced timelines. Some would go home soon. Some would stay longer to help rebuild what needed hands. Rumors surfaced that a handful might be allowed to remain, permanently under strict criteria: employment, conduct, community sponsorship. The idea felt, to some, like betrayal. To others, like mercy braided with pragmatism. The auxiliary told herself she would decide later. That was the lie she could still afford. That decisions make themselves if you wait long enough. Another film screened. This time about institutions. Parliaments debating in public. Courts explaining verdicts. Editors arguing about headlines. It was, frankly, boring in places. That was the point. Boredom is what freedom often feels like from the inside. No one is banging on your door at midnight. Instead, someone is asking you to read a report and show up to vote. The auxiliary felt something like awe. She had been trained to associate excitement with importance. Now she wondered if predictability might be the more radical achievement. In the office, the bespectacled officer, whose name she now knew but still thought of as Sir, offered a rare comment while she stacked forms. "You're good at order," he said, almost grudgingly. She nodded, unsure how to receive praise in a place where praise wasn't currency. After a beat, she said, "Order without cruelty is new to me." He considered that. "It's not new," he replied. "It's just hard, so it's rare." The line landed with weight. Hard things masquerade as rare things, but they are achievable when people choose them consistently. When a sergeant slides a cup across a table because that's the rule and the culture, not because he's having an unusually generous day. The day the auxiliary was told she would be assigned longer-term farm work, the farmer's wife pressed a small packet into her hand. Tea leaves, wrapped in wax paper. "For your own cup," she said. "For when you need to think." That night, the auxiliary brewed it carefully, rationing the leaves as if each could steep a better choice. She sat on her bunk, hands around a mug that had survived other lives, and pictured a map with two roads. One returned her to a place that had shattered and asked her to rebuild among ruins with people who would not understand the changes in her face. The other offered a life she could not have imagined. Ordinary, supervised, tolerated at first, perhaps welcomed later. Neither road absolved her. The tea didn't tell her what to do. It told her to decide. Before sleep, she wrote a question on a scrap of paper and hid it under her mattress. If I stay, is it forgiveness or responsibility? She didn't yet know the answer. Sometimes history moves forward because someone decides without certainty and learns the answer by living it. We're moving toward the last third of this story, the part where policy intersects with the human heart in ways that make legislators nervous and neighbors talk. There will be applications, permissions, vows made in small rooms without flowers because flowers were for people with ration coupons to spare. There will be debates that sound surprisingly modern, about loyalty, identity, security, trust. And there will be a final scene with a cup of tea that reframes everything you've heard. If you've come this far, don't stop. The strongest arguments always appear at the end, after the groundwork of evidence and experience has been laid. Stay with me. We've built the scaffolding. Next, we climb. Winter crept in with a clean, blue cold that sharpened breath and minds alike. The auxiliary learned the facilities, seasons the way farmers learn their fields. Inspections came more often before holidays. Parcels arrived in clusters. Letters tended to show up on the same afternoon each week, as if the post itself obeyed a moral calendar. Routine, she realized, was not a trick to lull people. It was a promise kept in public. A notice appeared on the board one morning written in precise, matter-of-fact language. Categories, criteria, procedures. It explained who, by strict definition, counted as a prisoner of war and who fell into related classifications. Auxiliary personnel, displaced persons, people under investigation. It outlined screenings for security risks and the appeals process when errors were made. The tone was dry by design. Dryness was a shield against improvisation. She was asked to translate during parts of intake. Names, past assignments, medical histories. It wasn't a promotion, it was practicality. Still, the work felt different than sorting files. Watching fear loosen its grip when someone understood the question being asked taught her something a projector could not. Clarity is mercy. In the evenings, discussions continued under a watchful calm. The schoolmaster-voiced moderator returned with lists and pencil stubs. He liked verbs. What did you read? What did you sign? What rule changed and when? Vague answers dissolved under his gaze. He didn't accuse. He insisted. There is a difference. Another newspaper appeared. This one carrying debates printed verbatim. She read lines of argument set down by representatives who knew their words would be scrutinized, archived, and remembered. The novelty stunned her. Power speaking in sentences the public could examine. She traced a finger under phrases about obligations to prisoners, timelines for return, the right balance between security and decency. It felt like eavesdropping on the machinery of fairness. Outside work continued because cows do not care about political theory. The farmer's wife taught her the soft art of predictability. Hang the milking stools in the same place. Rinse the pails twice. Count the animals as they enter and again as they leave. Look them in the eye so you know when one is unwell. Systems, the woman said without flourish. Save you when you're tired. The auxiliary tucked the sentence away like a ration coupon for a bad day. Inspections by neutral observers became almost unremarkable, which was their success. They asked about mattresses and medicine, about rations and wages paid for labor, about discipline and appeals. They looked with a consistency that made indifference difficult. The auxiliary felt something inside her aligning to that gaze. You behave differently when you know someone honest will check. On a gray afternoon, she returned from the farm to find a fresh notice tacked to the board. It outlined phased repatriation, priority for the sick, for those with dependent family, for those whose homes could receive them. It explained that those needed for essential labor could be retained for a time under strict standards, set hours, pay scales, days of rest, oversight. It was not a secret. Secrets had fueled too many disasters. That evening, talk in the barracks was subdued and practical. My mother writes that the apartment is gone. One woman said flatly, we would be 5 in a single room. Another had no one to write to at all. A third simply said, if I go back, I start over. If I stay, I start over. Either way, I start over. There were no speeches. War had made everyone allergic to drama. The guard with the rolling vowels stood by the fence. As usual, she joined him with the easy etiquette they had grown. Hands visible, distance maintained, tone civil. They're sending people home, she said. He watched a cloud slide over the field. As they should. And some will stay. For a bit. To help. Then home. He paused, weighing something he was not authorized to say, and then choosing the rule over the impulse. Paperwork's there for a reason, he added, nodding toward the office. It was both reassurance and boundary. A week later, in the multi-purpose hall with the humming projector, the screen lit up not with atrocity but with governance. A chamber, speeches, a vote. It was intentionally dull in places, And that was the lesson the auxiliary had been trained to think that importance must shout. Here, importance spoke at a reasonable volume, was recorded, and could be revisited to check what had been promised. The moderator's question afterward was simple. Which would you rather live under, thrilling lies or boring truths? She didn't answer out loud. Inside, something answered for her. Work credits accumulated in a ledger and became soap, thread, a tin mug to replace the dented one that belonged to the canteen. The first time she purchased something with earned credits, she felt a jolt that surprised her. Not pride. She wasn't ready for that. But participation, even small agency, is a training ground. In the office, the bespectacled officer handed her a typed circular to file. It described contacts with families, parcels, the right to receive news, and the duty to tell the truth in interviews. She filed it under correspondence, then asked if she could make a copy for the German language board. He approved with a grunt that could be interpreted as yes in any language. She pinned it up carefully, the tacks aligned like points on a compass. People read it. Questions slowed. Anxiety eased by a degree. Order works that way. 1 degree at a time. Spring crept back with an indecisive sun. The facility's gates became transitions rather than barriers as more women were escorted to farms, workshops, and municipal offices. Civilians learned to stop staring. The auxiliary noticed the discipline of politeness returning to public spaces. Cues that held, voices that stayed low even when tempers flared, disagreements that ended with a nod instead of a shove. It felt fragile and therefore precious. One afternoon, a rumor, careful, qualified, persistent, rippled through the camp. In certain cases, and with formal permission, personal relationships might be acknowledged. The rumor had the shape of a policy. Applications, interviews, character attestations, waiting periods measured not in whispers but in weeks. Not many, not easily, but possibly. The auxiliary didn't know what she felt about the idea. Relief? Fear? Both emotions were too loud. She reached for a quieter one. Responsibility? She had, after all, begun to talk in the office during breaks with a clerk whose hands were always ink-stained, who loved old books with spines gone soft, who made bad jokes quietly as if laughter might startle the paperwork. They did not flirt. They compared notes about sentences. They respected silence. If anyone asked, they were colleagues with good timing and better restraint. Another inspection passed. This one focused on work assignments and hours. Questions were specific. How many days off? How many hours in the field? What clothing issued for weather? Who recorded injuries and how quickly were they treated? It was the dull arithmetic of care. The auxiliary realized, with a flush she couldn't fully explain, that she liked being counted, not ranked. Counted. People who aren't counted can be disappeared without paperwork. She volunteered for language lessons offered in the hall. Not everybody wanted to. Sit on benches after a day of labor and learn how to conjugate verbs that would only matter if a future existed. She went anyway. The instructor, a teacher demobilized back into his natural habitat, made them read small pieces from newspapers and then, mercilessly, explain them in their own words. Think, he would say, tapping the paper, not repeat. As spring turned towards summer, the repatriation lists thickened. Names posted on the board drew people like magnets. Those who were leaving packed. With an economy born of rationing, those who were staying longer learned not to stare too long at departures. The auxiliary watched hugs given with restraint, tears swallowed with dignity. I scanned one last time across a yard that had become, against all reason, the site of a personal renaissance. She tried to imagine the street where she had grown up and could only conjure the outline. Addresses had become coordinates without walls. She drew a map in pencil and then put the paper away. Maps are promises. She wasn't ready to make one she couldn't keep. A small ceremony was held for a civic holiday. It consisted of a few remarks, a modest flag, and a minute of silence that felt like a cathedral. The guard with the rolling vowels stood ramrod straight. The auxiliary stood as well, not out of obedience to him, but out of respect for the idea that grief deserves good posture. After the ceremony, the farmer's wife pressed a parcel into her hands again, a hand-knitted pair of mitts, a wrapped wedge of cheese, and a fresh packet of tea. For thinking, the woman said, repeating her earlier phrase with the same sturdy kindness. The auxiliary wanted to say thank you in a way that covered all of it. The meals, the tools, the discipline, the mercy. But languages are poor when you need them most. She settled for thank you and hoped tone would do the rest. By midsummer, a new notice appeared, printed with insistent neatness. It outlined opportunities for longer placements where labor was short, rules for supervision, and the narrow path by which a person could apply to remain for a defined period under strict oversight. Sponsorship, good conduct, work essential to recovery, background checks. The policy didn't encourage fantasy. It offered procedure. Procedure, the auxiliary had learned, is where hope either survives honestly or dies cleanly. She sat on her bunk with the application in front of her, the tea cooling at her elbow, and did the hardest thing. She told the truth on paper. She listed her duties during the war without embroidery. She stated plainly what she had seen and what she had not, and where she had failed to ask questions that might have changed nothing but would have made her a different person. She asked for a chance to work on the farm for a longer term because work had rebuilt something in her that she could not name. She attached a brief note from the farmer's wife that was not flowery and therefore more powerful than any speech. The interview that followed was conducted by a man who looked like he had been born tired and heroic about it. He asked about discipline, about hours missed and why, about any infractions and how they were handled. He did not ask her to perform remorse. He asked her to outline responsibilities she understood and those she did not. At the end, he said the most adult sentence she had ever heard. "We will decide, and you will accept the decision." She nodded. It was strangely comforting to be addressed as someone capable of living with outcomes. That evening at the fence, she admitted to the guard what she had done. He listened and, for once, said nothing wise. He simply nodded, which was the kindest thing. Respect without intrusion. In the office the next day, the ink-fingered clerk placed a folded scrap of paper near her elbow and then busied himself with a ledger as if ledgers were the only proof of civilization. On the paper, a single sentence. "Whatever you choose, choose it on purpose." She tucked the note under the lining of her trunk as if it were a relic. Weeks stretched and snapped. Every morning, she checked the board, not with desperation, but with the disciplined curiosity of someone who has trained herself to accept not knowing. She worked well. She slept adequately. She thought more. In the hall, the language class read a piece about how democracies outlive their critics by being correctable. The phrase struck like flint. Correctable, not perfect, capable of. Repair because the parts are visible. One late afternoon, a group of men in suits walked through the facility with the particular gait of people memorizing facts for a report they will have to defend in a serious room. They looked at the kitchen sinks, at the inventory of blankets, at the books in the canteen. They asked the nurse questions that sounded like kindness translated into procedure. Stock levels, infection rates, dental supplies. The auxiliary felt an unexpected wave of gratitude for the nurse, for the clipboard, for the scale that made arguments weighable. In a world addicted to slogans, measurements are an antidote. The decision arrived on a day that felt like all the others until it didn't. A clerk read names in a clear voice. Her own appeared in the second group. Temporary placement approved under supervision. Further review in due course. Continued adherence to rules required. No fanfare, no smile. Just the policy doing what policy does when people keep to it. She returned to the farm with the permission folded like a bird in her pocket. The farmer's wife said, "Good," and handed her a list of tasks that did not care about victory or defeat. Lists are honest that way. If you're still here, I want to hear from you. When you changed your mind about something big, was it because of a single dramatic moment? Or because a system of small, fair practices made the old belief untenable? Put the word moment or system in your comment and tell me why. Your stories add texture to the history we're sharing. We're moving now toward the final hinge, where policy meets intimacy and the future becomes something you can hold, not just imagine. There will be official permissions with language so cautious it could walk a tightrope. There will be neighbors who approve and neighbors who do not. There will be a conversation over tea that feels like laying down a weapon, and there will be a last line you'll carry into your week as a test you can apply in your own life. Stay with me. The end matters. Summer blurred into a steady gold, and the facility exhaled. By then, the auxiliary could read the place like a clock. When the bell would ring, when the laundry kettles hissed, when inspectors preferred to arrive mid-morning, after the kitchen had finished the rush but before the paperwork slept. She understood, too, that the rules were not there to impress outsiders. They were there to keep the inside from sliding back into the lazy gravity of cruelty. A new circular appeared, plain type, no flourishes. It clarified what everyone had been whispering. In narrow, supervised circumstances, personal associations could be recognized, not encouraged, not romanticized, recognized. Applications, interviews, attestations of conduct, waiting periods. The words were cautious, like a person testing ice. But caution is not the same as refusal. Caution is hope with homework. In the office, the ink-fingered clerk signed for a delivery of forms and offered a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. They had learned to talk without wasting adjectives. About books, about the virtue of clear minutes in meetings, about how a sentence that states obligations plainly is a little act of public service. They still did not flirt. They compared footnotes and jokes that left no trace. On a soft evening, the guard with the rolling vowels poured hot water from a battered kettle into 2 tin mugs and handed one through the gap in the wire with the kind of rule. Bending, that is, in fact, the spirit of the rule. For thinking, he said, borrowing the farmer's wife's phrase without knowing it. Steam rose between them like a flag that meant only civil. She took a careful sip. "Does this ever get easy?" she asked. He considered, as if the answer mattered beyond the fence. "No," he said. "It gets normal. That's better. Normal, not triumphant, not sentimental. Normal." She filed the word alongside correctable and procedure in the small lexicon she had been building since the first cup of tea. The interview for her longer placement was held in a room with windows that let in a sky the color of polished pewter. 2 officials asked questions that had edges. Where were you posted? What did you sign? What rules did you enforce? When did you suspect a story you were told was untrue? And what did you do with the suspicion? She answered without embroidery. When the questions pressed against the tender parts, she didn't perform. She described. There is a difference. Outside, a truck rattled past, loaded with lumber for a bridge that had learned too much about gravity in the last years. Inside, a pen scratched the final line. Permission granted, review to follow, adherence to standards required. No applause. The documents did not know how to clap. They knew how to bind. At the farm, work expanded to fit the hours. Available, as honest work always does. Calves needed bottle feeding. Fences needed mending. Milking was a schedule that tolerated no poetry. The farmer's wife, the word formidable fashioned into an apron, taught her the practical tenderness of chores. How to check a hoof for a stone. How to scrape a pail quietly so as not to startle. How to ration tea leaves so the future got a cup too. Save enough for tomorrow's thinking, she would say, and set the kettle with military precision. In town, she stood in queues where differences weakened under the weight of rationed books and patience. People looked, then looked away, then learned not to look. A grocer rang up a purchase without stinginess of tone. A child stared and asked a blunt question that his mother answered with the gentle tyranny of good manners. Bit by bit, suspicion frayed into routine. Routine, she realized, is the peace treaty most of us live inside. Another inspection came and went. This team cared about hours and rest days, boots and soap, dental paste and bandage stock. They ticked boxes that, in a different story, would seem small. In this story, they were the box-shaped outline of decency. She found herself sleeping better for reasons a poet would never praise, because mattresses were counted and latrines were measured. Civilization is nothing if not the triumph of measurement over mood. In the hall, the language class read a piece about the scaffolding of democracy, elections you could lose without vanishing, courts you could criticize without disappearing, newspapers that corrected themselves in print. The instructor, cruel only to laziness, made them explain each paragraph in their own words. Think, he said, not repeat. The sentence felt like a key that had been there all along, just under the mat. A month later, a thin envelope arrived addressed to her in a hand she recognized from official documents. She opened it with the same care she used on a stubborn nod. A date, a place, a time, a Formal conversation in a civic office with a table that had heard more eulogies for bad ideas than any pulpit. The purpose was printed in language so sober it could drive. Confirmation of placement. Conditions reiterated. Community sponsorship acknowledged. She walked to the office with the farmer's wife at her side, and the ink-fingered clerk a discreet step behind. Inside, the official read terms that were almost liturgical in their restraint. Work to be done, conduct to be maintained. Oversight to be expected, reviews scheduled. Decisions, he said, would continue to be made by policy, not rumor. She nodded because nodding is what adults do when they accept the grammar of responsibility. On the way out, the clerk paused by a bulletin board where a local society had posted notices for a lecture on town planning, a request for volunteers to repair a playground, and a reading group schedule. He touched the corner of the lecture notice. Dry, he said, but dry is where the future hangs its coat. She laughed, first at the line, then at the realization that she believed it. News filtered back from those who had returned home, a word that had to be bent to fit new realities. Some found a room with an ant and a stove. Some found only intersections where buildings used to introduce themselves. Letters described reunions and absences with the same flat syntax. The difference was in the weight of the paper where a hand pressed harder to say what words could not. She read them with a tenderness that was half solidarity, half survivor's guilt, and answered with paragraphs about cows and fences and the mercies of a schedule. A small civic service took place on a wind-polished morning, not a parade. Rationing had taught everyone to distrust spectacle, but a gathering. A few words about loss. A few words about building. A hymn hummed as if the tune were shy. She stood among people who were once only categories and was startled to find herself included in the pronoun. We, when the vicar said, "We will do this together." Inclusion is an ordinary miracle. It happens in sentences before it happens in hearts. That afternoon, she sat at the farm's table with the clerk and the farmer's wife. The kettle grumbled, then settled into a contented hiss. The farmer's wife poured and left them to talk, a gesture of trust executed with rural efficiency. The clerk wrapped his hands around his mug as if gripping reason itself. "I wrote a statement about you," he said, looking not at her, but at the steam. Not a defense, a description, work done, rules followed, contributions made, future imagined in practical terms. She took a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged in a way that discharged the emotion harmlessly. "It's what we do for each other when rules are good. We describe the truth." Silence did the courteous thing and stepped aside for meaning. In that space, they did not promise anything they could not keep. They did not use the future as a sedative. They sipped their tea, two citizens of a place that had chosen to survive by being decent on time. The final film at the hall was, perversely, the quietest. No camps, no speeches, streets being swept. A council meeting where a budget was argued with civility sharp enough to cut and safe enough to heal. A school with a line of children washing hands. A clinic vaccinating infants with the soft ferocity of public health. The moderator didn't ask questions after. He simply said, "This is what victory looks like when you stop needing the word." The room sat with the idea until the benches creaked. With the weight of it, when the auxiliary, no, call her by what the future will call her, a worker, walked back through the dusk, the guard by the fence tipped his cap. "All right," he asked, in the universal language of men who keep their eloquence for emergencies. "All right," she said, and meant it the way a mechanic means functioning. Years turn the way pages do when the binding is strong. She learned the names of clouds by the chores they recommend. She learned the feeling of a community, where people argued in daylight and shook hands when the vote was counted. She learned that some neighbors' stares soften only when they need a fence mended and you show up with pliers. She learned to write to those who had gone back and to mourn those who had no mail. She learned how to live inside a standard instead of under a slogan. One autumn, a letter arrived from a former roommate in the barracks, now back in a pulverized city stitching life out of thread and determination. "Do you ever forget the film?" the friend asked. "I don't," she replied. "No, but now I measure my days by smaller reels, milk foaming in a pail, a ledger that balances, a vote recorded in minutes, a cup of tea poured without a qualifying clause. If we cannot undo what we saw, we can make daily scenes that do not rhyme with it." on a winter evening. She poured tea for a child with questions that children always ask when the world has been unkind in their parents' stories. "Were you afraid?" the child asked. "Yes," she said, because truth is what she owed. But the thing that frightened me most wasn't a shout. It was a kindness I wasn't prepared to understand. It made me see my own certainty as a stranger. The child nodded the solemn nod children reserve for information that will ripen later. She lifted her mug and looked into the ordinary dark swirl. "Remember this," she added gently. "How people treat you when they don't have to shows who they are, and who you might become if you're brave enough to change." This is where we leave her. Not at a parade, not at a dramatic confession, but at a table with a cooling cup and a life that keeps the peace by practicing it. The first cup in that intake room cracked propaganda because it was hospitality backed by law, kindness enforced by oversight, decency scheduled, inspected, and renewed. A simple act became a lever because a system chose to make it typical. If this story reshaped how you think about victory, or if it reminded you that the strongest weapon is often the rule you refuse to break when no one is watching, like this video and subscribe. It tells the algorithm there's an audience for history that honors facts over slogans and people over caricatures. And I want to hear your voice. What's your cup of tea moment? One small, fair act that made you question a belief you thought was unshakable? Share it in the comments. Your story might be the kindness that cracks someone else's certainty. If you want more World War II episodes built from official archives, parliamentary debates, and neutral inspections, stories where the evidence is as compelling as the narrative, hit the bell. We're building a community that argues in daylight and keeps the kettle on. Years later, the world learned to speak in lowercase again. Headlines shrank to council budgets and harvest yields. The worker, she had long since outgrown the word auxiliary, wrote letters on Sunday evenings at the same table where the farmer's wife measured tea leaves with the careful thrift of experience. She told friends who had gone back what ordinary triumph looked like. Boots mended before they failed, tools put away every night, a ledger that matched the shelf, a vote that felt dull and therefore felt safe. She never forgot the films or the notices, or the dry courage of procedures read aloud and obeyed because they were right, not because someone was shouting. But she learned to carry those memories like tools, not like stones. When neighbors tested her with small provocations, she answered with punctuality and clean work. When someone muttered that rules were for other people, she smiled the kind of smile that says, "Rules are how we keep the roof from leaking." There were days when suspicion resurfaced like an old bruise in cold weather. A parcel went missing. A roomer walked through town without paying. A letter arrived late, and the old reflex to assume the worst tugged at the hem of her patience. On those days, she made tea, not as an escape, but as a ritual reminder that decency can be scheduled. Kettle, leaves, water, wait. The 4 steps were a small constitution. In time, the clerk with ink on his fingers became something else. A partner in errands first, then in plans, finally in the ordinary work of a shared life. They did everything slowly, the way you test a bridge before you drive a cart across, forms filed, interviews attended, sponsorship affirmed in the unromantic language of responsibility. Their first celebration was a cup poured in a kitchen that had seen grief and inventory in equal measure. Someone said congratulations and meant, "We will hold you to your promises." It was exactly the blessing they wanted. The guard with the rolling vowels drifted out of their daze the way guards do when gates become lines painted on memory. She saw him once more, years later, at a market. He nodded as if acknowledging a job completed to spec. She nodded back as if to say, "The spec saved us." The farmer's wife aged the way oak ages, grain deepening, edges softening into something that looked like wisdom even when she insisted it was only practice. On her last birthday, they brewed tea strong enough to anchor a ship and said very little. Gratitude doesn't need prose. It needs presence from time to time. Visitors came and asked the worker for her story. What they meant was spectacle. She offered structure instead. She talked about oversight and schedules, about how wages for labor were counted and how punishments had definitions, about how a notice on a wall can be a promise if inspections are real. Some looked disappointed. She didn't mind. Drama is the enemy of memory when the truth is patient. When her daughter, always more curious than respectful, as children should be in healthy places. Asked the inevitable question, she answered without embroidery. Were you scared? Yes, but not for the reason you think. She explained that the most frightening thing was discovering that kindness, delivered inside a system of standards, breaks propaganda faster than rage. Rage gives you an excuse not to think. Kindness makes you pick up facts and carry them until your arms are strong enough to hold a new idea. The daughter frowned, then nodded with the solemn pragmatism of youth. So the tea was the weapon, she said. The tea was the first crack, her mother replied. The law, the inspections, the boring truths. That's what made the crack widen. The cup showed me there was a door. The rules kept it open long enough for me to walk through. She kept one memento from those early months. A dented tin cup, clean now, set on a shelf where it caught the afternoon light. When friends asked why she hadn't replaced it with something finer, she said what the clerk had once written on a scrap of paper. Whatever you choose, choose it on purpose. She chose to remember on purpose. And because memory is a civic duty, not just a private act, she gave back where she could. She helped at the hall when language lessons resumed, making tea for newer arrivals who stared at unfamiliar alphabets the way she had once stared at unfamiliar rules. She underlined verbs with a stub of pencil and said, gently, think, not repeat. She stocked the canteen with soap and thread because civilization is measured in small mercies that show up on time. When anniversaries came around, the town marked them with modest rituals. Minutes of silence, lists of names read without haste, a flag lifted and lowered with hands that did not tremble. She stood among neighbors and sent a grateful thought to the places where arguments were still recorded and votes still counted even when they stung. Victory, she knew, isn't a feeling, it's a habit. Sometimes, at dusk, she walked the lane between hedges and thought about the women who had shared her barracks. Some had gone home and found rooms where loss slept in every chair. Some had stayed and learned to be ordinary citizens with extraordinary care. Some had disappeared into the silence that trauma prefers. She held them all in a quiet roll call. Grief, discipline, gratitude, the trinity of survival. One evening, a visitor asked the question that tries to tidy history into a headline. If you had to say in one sentence what broke the spell, what would it be? She looked at the dented cup on the shelf, at the neat stack of ledgers on the table, at the notice board where meeting minutes were still posted for anyone to read. Then she said the sentence she wished someone had told her sooner. How people treat you when they don't have to tell you who they are, and gives you permission to change who you are. That is the story behind the title you clicked. WW2. The cup of tea that shattered Nazi propaganda. It wasn't magic. It was policy with a human face. Law with a kettle on. Oversight that kept the promise warm. A cup offered because the rules said you treat people like people, especially when it would be easier not to. If this journey changed how you think about strength, if it made you see that the most powerful victories are the ones that become normal, like this video, and subscribe, it tells the algorithm there's an audience for fact-driven history told without shouting. And I want to hear from you. What's your own cup of tea moment? 1. Measured, decent act that cracked a belief you were certain of? Drop it in the comments. Your story might be the steady kindness someone else needs to see. Keep the kettle on. Keep the standards high. I'll see you in the next episode. When anniversaries came around, the town marked them with modest rituals. Minutes of silence, lists of names read without haste, a flag lifted and lowered with hands that did not tremble. She stood among neighbors and sent a grateful thought to the places where arguments were still recorded and votes still counted even when they stung. Victory, she knew, isn't a feeling, it's a habit. Sometimes, at dusk, she walked the lane between hedges and thought about the women who had shared her barracks. Some had gone home and found rooms where loss slept in every chair. Some had stayed and learned to be ordinary citizens with extraordinary care. Some had disappeared into the silence that trauma prefers. She held them all in a quiet roll call. Grief, discipline, gratitude, the trinity of survival. One evening, a visitor asked the question that tries to tidy history into a headline. If you had to say in one sentence what broke the spell, what would it be? She looked at the dented cup on the shelf, at the neat stack of ledgers on the table, at the notice board where meeting minutes were still posted for anyone to read. Then she said the sentence she wished someone had told her sooner. How people treat you when they don't have to tell you who they are, and gives you permission to change who you are. That is the story behind the title you clicked. WW2. The cup of tea that shattered Nazi propaganda. It wasn't magic. It was policy with a human face. Law with a kettle on. Oversight that kept the promise warm. A cup offered because the rules said you treat people like people, especially when it would be easier not to. If this journey changed how you think about strength,